समुद्रवसने देवी पर्वतस्तनमण्डले विष्णुपत्न्यै नमस्तुभ्यं पादस्पर्शं क्षमस्व मे. Those who dare to fly don't care to leave their footprints behind. Welcome to FVS.
Of course, are the skin that you have all around. It could be a single skin for smaller aircraft, but for as the aircraft become larger, especially the A380 or the Boeing 747, etc., is made out of multiple panels which are joined to each other. And depending upon the material, the kind of joining technology varies. The older day technologies were more in terms of countersunk rivets, whereas now it is more in terms of adhesive joints and or rivets in a combination. Again, depends on the specific materials that are utilized over there. So in addition to the cover skin, you see the elements which run along the length, very similar to what we had in the case of the wing, which we call here as also as stringers and longerons, especially if they are very long and running almost through the entire fuselage. And here you see there are smaller ones over here, which are the typical stringers. They need to be cut out. For example, in this case, it's because of a door. Somewhere else, it could be because of a window, etc. And so these make some of these stiffening elements running in the longitudinal direction shorter. Then, apart from these longitudinal stiffeners, you have the transverse stiffeners, an example of which you see over here, which is the frame. And some of these frames, especially where the wing is attached, for example, that you see over here, could be much larger compared to the other frames because of the larger loads that are coming in from the wing over there. In addition, you would have, apart from these frames, which are transverse stiffeners, you would have much larger transverse stiffeners in the form of pressure bulkheads, which are typically at the rear end and the front end of the fuselage. So let's look further. So the predominant loads coming from it are not the air loads, because the air loads on a fuselage are much smaller than those on the wing, because the wing is generating the lift and the drag. Even the tail, horizontal tail and the vertical tail would probably have a larger set of air loads compared to the fuselage. But of course, the fuselage is so large that when you integrate these loads over the entire fuselage, they could be large. But what we are looking at is a load transfer point of view at a given location on the fuselage skin, cover skin. It could be in the belly part, which is the bottom part, or it could be in the sides, or it could be somewhere in the top. Wherever it is, it's basically a local air pressure that is coming. And there's two sets of air pressure. One is coming from the outside, the other is from the inside. The inside is something substantial, especially for passenger aircraft, those which are flying at higher altitudes, which is the case with most commercial aircraft. And so you would see that being a substantial load. But the air load, which is coming from the external airflow, because the aircraft is moving through the air, is much smaller than those in the aerodynamic surfaces. So the primary loads, the second one, as I said, is the internal pressure for the passenger aircraft. So which means that in terms of the geometry suggestion, the most efficient configuration will be a circular cross-section. As you do see in this case of the Boeing 777, it's almost circular, but at least it would be somewhere close to an oval kind of a configuration in most situations. But in addition to the internal pressure for such passenger aircraft, for all aircraft, you would have the concentrated forces which are coming from the fairings. So you would have some fairings there which attach the wing to the fuselage. In some situations, you'd have the wing running through the length, through the cross-section of the fuselage, so it would be a single structure, the entire wing. But in some cases, it could be joined at a particular location through fairings. So that becomes a very, very critical location. So as you know, the wing, we said, is like a cantilever beam with a distributed load. And at the root, it suffers the maximum bending moment as well as the maximum stresses. And therefore, how it is joined to the fuselage is very, very critical over there. So a concentrated force coming from the wing over there, and in the rear end, this might be just the central fuselage construction. Here you see the much larger frame over there, probably close to where the, let's say, rear engine is attached, for example. Not in this case, but in other cases. But it could also be where the empennage is attached. You would want that. But of course, there will also be a rear pressure bulkhead at the rear end as well. So from the tail, there would be concentrated forces where the tail is attached to the fuselage. In addition, the landing gear, so especially the nose landing gear, because the rear landing gears are usually on the wing, unless, of course, you have a very small aspect ratio wing, in which case sometimes you might have it and a large fuselage, like in a wing, when going more towards a blended wing body, you would have it on the fuselage as well. But in most situations, you would have the landing gear loads, which are coming both on the wing as well as on the fuselage. So here we are focusing on the fuselage. Then, of course, there is a payload which is on top of this floor beam as far as the people are concerned in a passenger aircraft, but there's also a lot of cargo that is there in the bottom portion over here, and that is also causing a load. So the floor beam is a very, very important structural component over here, and the choice of materials and the geometry becomes important. The geometry, of course, is dictated from it being flat as for the movement of the passengers on top of it and the location of the seats, etc. So in terms of the shape, you might not have much of a change, but where it is located on top in terms of the height, there you would have some kind of a leeway. Again, depends upon maximizing the room for the passengers, at the same time having enough room for the cargo volume to occupy the bottom portion. In addition to the cargo volume, you would have many other connections, electrical connections, the control connections, etc., running through below the floor of the fuselage. So therefore, essentially, as you see, we might give names to each one of these in terms of the cover skin, the stringers, longerons, frames, and bulkheads, etc. But essentially, it's nothing but a thin shell, which means it's a 2D element, which we have looked at as basically a shear panel. Yeah, and so a 2D element, which is your shear thin shell, and then your stringers, which are essentially 1D elements, and the transverse frames are also essentially 1D elements because their cross-sectional dimension is very small compared to the overall length of the frame, which is basically the circumference of the fuselage itself. But if you look at their bulkheads, they are more in terms of 2D configuration, very similar to the transverse ribs that you have in the wing and horizontal vertical tails. So you have two kinds of transverse stiffeners, some of which are 1D, some of which are more like 2D. So then let's look at each one of these elements. The skin, as you know, carries, just like any other 2D element, predominantly the shear stresses. Again, the shear stresses could be due to multiple reasons. There could be torques. Why could the torque be? Because let's say there's an engine attached here. The weight of the engine is going to act in a location or through a center line, which is different from the center line of the fuselage. So there is a moment arm that is there. So this length times the engine weight could be acting on that. Similarly, whatever is the lift distribution which is coming at the fairing over here, again is acting at a location which is away from the center line. So that will cause a torque, but it's not throughout because it's going to be balanced by what is coming from the other wing, unless the aircraft is performing a roll maneuver, in which case you would have basically put the aileron down on the right side and right side to me, and on the left side of the port wing, you would have it up, and therefore there is a lesser lift there and a more lift on this side, and therefore the starboard goes up and the port goes down, port side of the wing. So this is a nomenclature which is used typically to distinguish the right side as the starboard and the left side as the port wing. And so in such situations, yes, you would have a little bit of torque coming from the differential lift that you have, which is transmitting from the wing to the fuselage. But otherwise, if you look at the horizontal tail, you'd never have a differential there. It's only from the wing that you could have a differential like that. And also, at least a part of it is experiencing a little bit of torque, because this weight, even when it is a symmetric loaded structure, that load is actually causing some kind of a transverse shear acting through this, essentially. And that transverse shear has to be accounted for in any case. So the second source of that is the transverse force. And more often than not, this is the larger of the two, something that needs to be taken into account even more than the torque. But it's the combination that is important under different flight phases. Then the skin also takes the hoop stresses due to the internal pressure, as we said, in a passenger aircraft flying at higher altitudes, where the external ambient pressure, as you know, is very less. And so you can't survive at such low pressures. Of course, you do not provide the atmospheric pressure at sea level, which would be too expensive. One, from the structural point of view, because the design would require a much thicker skin, and also from once you have a thicker skin, you have a larger weight and the efficiency of the aircraft will come down. So typically you will have an internal pressurization which is at a certain altitude, and again these are specified by the certifying agencies and are strictly followed. So next, continuing with the fuselage structure, more in the form of a schematic that you see in the figure over here. These are the three main components. You have the skin, the stringers or longerons, and the frame or the bulkhead. So coming to, we just saw the role of the skin already. So this is taken care of. Now we will look at the frame or the ring or the bulkhead. So this is essentially for performing a very analogous function to what the transverse ribs were in the case of the wing and the stabilizers. So here, there it was maintaining the aerodynamic shapes, the airfoil shapes, cross sections. Here it is maintaining a circular cross section or a near circular cross section of the fuselage, so that the volume or the cross sectional area that it is designed for is more or less maintained under all flight phases. So it's to maintain the fuselage shape. Then it, of course, depending upon the pitch. So by pitch, we mean the distance between two adjacent stringers. So that pitch, let's say it's P. So that if the smaller it is, it would reduce the span of the stringers, so that even though it might be a longeron which is running all through, the effective length that is of consequence is just that P portion over there of length P. So that the transverse frames, by their very existence, they reduce the span of the stringers between the supports, which essentially means that those of them which are under compression, again, it depends on the bending loads that are coming. And depending upon the bending load, whether it's the overhang portion or the interior portion, as we said, the fuselage can be dealt with as a simply supported beam with a overhang on both the sides, more on the nose side. So depending upon that, you would have mostly because of the self-weight and the other loads coming from the reactions from the two supports of the simply supported beam, namely the wing and the tail. You have the bending coming up, and so some of these stringers will be under compression. So even when the aircraft is on the ground, for example, just the self-weight, you can see that the top portion, these stringers on the top will be under tension, whereas the ones at the bottom will be under compression. The situation remains somewhat similar in terms of where the tension and compression is. And so you would choose materials which are better in compression in locations which are known to be prone to compression, and vice versa. So the effect of the frame, of course, is in terms of increasing the buckling strength of these stringers, and therefore their instability is either postponed or completely avoided. Whereas the skin may, even here in the case of the fuselage, sometimes be allowed to operate in the post-buckle regime, but more so in the aerodynamic surfaces than over here. On the other hand, the heavy bulkheads that I talked about, the front and the rear, close to where the cockpit is and close to where the empennage, that is the tails are. So these are typically much heavier, but once again, they are transverse stiffeners, and these heavy bulkheads will especially distribute large concentrated forces, and that's why they are located in such locations. So we saw that in the Boeing 777 example, how the frame closer to where the wing is attached is much larger in cross section compared to the regular frames. So these will distribute such large concentrated loads, which could be coming from the wing, which could be coming from the nose landing gear, it could be coming from the empennage, or if an engine is attached to the fuselage. So the podded aircraft that we talked about in the previous class. So, in addition, the small self-equilibrated loads on most of the frames, that is not the bulkheads we are not talking about. So, most of the frames are having very small self-equilibrated loads. The whole idea is to get the force or the pressure from the air loads transmitted through the skin to the stringer, and from the stringer to the frame, eventually to be transmitted to the floor beam that you have over there. And of course, the reactions, that is the simply supported beam, is having a hinge over here and another hinge over here where the wing and the tail are attached. So it's basically transmitting the load to those locations through the bulkheads or frames that are over those locations. So whereas the other frames, the ones that you see in this example over here in the schematic, those are usually of a very light construction. In other words, the cross-sectional area is very small, and the material requirements are not also as stringent as, for example, in the case of the stringer or the floor beam. So then the final component over here is, we already seen the skin and the stringer. Now we will take up the stringer or the longeron. So these stringers, as is evident in the case of the wing as well as the fuselage over here, carry the bending moment which is coming, and they would carry them in the form of axial loads, because each of them is not actually under compression and tension to cause a balance of the bending moment, but they are operating as a team. So that's the teamwork of these stringers is important. Some of the stringers under compression, some under tension, so that essentially together they are carrying the bending moment. So usually when we say a beam is under bending, you expect a neutral axis and portions in tension and compression, but that's not what we are talking about in the case of the stringer. Essentially, they are like axial rods, which are primarily carrying axial forces, so some of them compressive forces, some of them tensile forces. And in addition, as you say, we saw in the previous class, the example of the podded aircraft, where you have the engine attached to the fuselage, the thrust of that engine. So if the engine is attached somewhere over here, you would see that the thrust that is coming from the engine is actually acting like an axial load. And it's also causing bending if it was just a single engine. But obviously you have engines on both the sides, so it's not going to cause the bending because of that. Both are going to compensate each other. But if there is a single engine failure, which is why it is required to have multiple engines, especially in passenger aircraft, including business aircraft, for which this podded configuration is very common, you would have, once one of the engine is off, the other engine is causing a thrust, which is not only causing an axial load in the stringers, but it's also causing the bending for the overall fuselage. And because of that, an additional axial load algebraically speaking, of course, cost on the various stringers, depending on which side they are of the engine which is off. So next is the next purpose of the stringer is also to stabilize the skin. Just like the ribs are reducing the skin panel size in this direction, the skin panel size in the circumferential direction is reduced by the pitch of the stringers in the circumferential direction. How far apart are the stringers? So that creates a small strip-like panel, which is what essentially is taking the load, because once it crosses a stringer, it's able to transfer its air loads onto that stringer. So you don't need to consider the entire wing panel, the fuselage skin, but just that part of the panel between them. And that's why many situations you can have even closed form analytical solutions which might work reasonably well. If you have, of course, estimated the loads also with a reasonable accuracy. So with this, we have completed our understanding of load factors, wherein we saw how the inertial loads in terms of the G factors, how many Gs is the aircraft flying at, and versus the velocity, because that dictates the dynamic pressure. So we saw the critical design points on the flight envelope for which the aircraft needs to be designed. So that was the flight envelope or the load factor study. And then we saw the load transfer as well. Now that we have done that, we have looked at pretty much all the fundamentals of the flight vehicle structure. So in the rest of today's class, we'll revisit the aircraft materials that we have already encountered earlier, and see what additional information we can make based on the classes that we have had in the recent past. And once we are done with that, we will get into the theory of elasticity, because then we know we have chosen the material, we know what kind of structures they are, some of them 1D, some of them 2D. How do you go about analyzing them? For that, we will set up the terminology and also put it in that bigger picture that we formed of 4 categories of variables, namely loads, stresses, strains, and deformation, and the 3 sets of equations which relate them, namely the stress equilibrium equations, the constitutive law, and the kinematics, which relate pairs of these, and essentially putting them all together, we arrived at that either a 4x4 matrix, which is good enough, or if you want to compare with results of others, you can go for a 6x6 matrix, as we said. And in many situations, they could be, because of the thin structures, both thin-walled as well as thin skins, you could have essentially, whether you're treating the fuselage as a simply supported beam with the overhang, or the aerodynamic surfaces as cantilever beams, in both of these situations, you could have the elements of that matrix 4x4 being not constants, but actually functions of the 1D strains that are involved, namely the extensional strain on the wing, let's say the 2 bending curvatures, one in the lift direction, the other in the drag direction, and the torsion coming because of the pitching moment and the various concentrated forces acting at lever away from the CG, or whichever point you want to consider the reference curve at. So let's look at these fuselage and the aerodynamic surface materials. The traditional materials, as we already saw, were the aluminum, titanium, and steel alloys. But in addition, for various engine parts, you could use nickel-based alloys, especially in the turbine stages. And examples of those are like Inconel, etc., which are predominantly used in most aircraft engines. In addition, we saw composites also being replacing a lot of these metallic alloys, but still in many of the aircrafts, including the ones like the Airbus 350, where you have 50% composites, you still have about 20% or so of the aluminium alloys, about 10% or so of the steel, etc., because there are certain locations where these still have a particular role to play. But the kind of aluminium alloys that we have moved on to, for example, in the Airbus A350 or even in the Eurofighter Typhoon, is more away from the traditional aluminium alloys of the 2000, 7000 series to aluminium lithium alloys. Many of the aluminium lithium alloys are also in the 2000 series. Some of them are in the 8000 series. But essentially, you're moving towards more high performance alloys, but they have issues as well. We will come to those shortly. But let's go from the ones which are more commonly used, especially in aircraft which are still flying, like, for example, the Boeing 747, 737, the Airbus 320, 330, etc. Many of those are still flying, and those use some of the older alloys, and so we need to have an understanding of them as well. And we are not restricted just to transport aircraft. We are also looking at recreational aircraft, smaller aircraft, that is. We could be looking at business aircraft and the military aircraft as well. So we need to have an understanding of many of those. Very interestingly, though fighters were somewhat pioneers other than helicopters in introducing composites, still the percentage of usage of composites in many of the fighters is still smaller compared to what you have in the case of the Airbus A350 and the Boeing 787, which is more than 50% by volume. If you look at by weight, it may be close to 70-80%. That's not surprising because of the temperature requirements, because most of these are flying at very high Mach numbers. So in the previous example, when we talked about the fuselage, we talked only about the mechanical loads, but there are also thermal loads which are coming because of the aerodynamic heating. And it becomes even more stringent when you go to spacecraft or launch vehicles, especially the re-entry vehicles, where the aerodynamic heating can be tremendous. So you do need to take into account not only in the aircraft engine materials like that, but other places as well. So polymer matrix composites, even if made out of thermoplastic matrices, may not be suitable there, and you need to go for more refined materials with higher thermal capability. And depending upon the Mach number, the temperature, which is the skin temperature, can be very large. The skin temperature typically varies as whatever is the ambient temperature that you have, T ambient, times 1 plus m squared by 5 approximately. So this is what is the skin temperature, the temperature of the skin of, let's say, the fuselage or the wing, etc. So essentially, this is almost like a stagnation kind of a temperature, but not precisely, because not all points are stagnation points, and therefore this is a reasonably good approximation to have. And so you would see that this additional term that is there, m squared by 5, is going to cause heating. And as the m increases, let's say in hypersonic kind of applications where m could be of the order of 5, let's say, so 25 by 2, you're looking at 12.5. So it's not a small thing. Whereas when you're looking at subsonic aircraft of about 0.2, etc., this is not going to matter much. It is usually ignored. So that's the reason why in many fighter aircraft you might still be using metals, but there's also a tendency to move towards a different kind of composites, that is the metal matrix composite and the ceramic matrix composites. In the case of the space shuttle, as you know, you have the tiles, which could be ceramic tiles. There's also a possibility of carbon-carbon materials over there. So the inner material could still be a low temperature capability material like aluminium. And of course, that led to, as you know, many of you know, disaster in 2003 when the Space Shuttle Columbia, where something foam from the fuel tank got separated, hit the leading edge, and where you had on the Space Shuttle, you had the tiles, which were thermal protection systems, which got damaged, because of which in the re-entry phase, you had the heat seeping into the aluminium structure, the aluminium alloy, which was not capable of handling that, and it was disastrous. I think about 7 of the astronauts died in that. These accidents investigation actually provide us a lot of information. It's unfortunate that we have to learn from them, but it's the whole idea is to ensure something like that or anything even close to that doesn't occur in the future. So we make the design changes in terms of the choice of materials, geometries, etc., to ensure the overall design is much safer. So coming back, the traditional metals are aluminum, titanium, and steel alloys. The advanced fiber reinforced plastics are it's not actually new. Unfortunately, it's not gotten into the curriculum as much as it should. Even in the undergraduate curriculum, it's very important that composite studies are introduced, because these have been around as far as aircraft are concerned in a fairly large fractions for almost 40 years. Yes, the Boeing 787 and 350 are quite recent in terms of more than 50%, but if you look at many military aircraft and the helicopters, especially, you have had a very large usage of composites for a very long period of time. In the case of the helicopter rotor blades, it helps us to move towards hingeless and bearingless helicopter rotors, which means lesser number of parts, lesser amount of maintenance, lesser amount of downtime for the helicopter, and therefore the costs come down. Whether it's a helicopter or even a commercial aircraft like what we have been looking at over here, the cost is going to be dictated not only by the initial cost, which is turns out to be just 1/3 of the approximately 1/3 of the overall life cycle cost of an aircraft, because this aircraft is going to fly for about typically like 60,000 hours during its entire life, spread out over many years. So it could be about, let's say, 30 years or so. And again, varies, but I'm saying in terms of the typical numbers. So out of that 30 hours, leaving out all the downtimes for maintenance, etc., actual flying time could be of the order of 7 years. So if you just add the flight durations over the entire life cycle of about 30 years, 7 of those years, it's actually flying. And which means that the kind of fatigue loads that it is undergoing because of the gusts, because of the landings, so many landings that it undertakes, etc. So it becomes very essential for us to understand these from various perspectives in terms of the maintenance, etc. So the initial cost is only 1/3. The other 2/3 typically go into the service and the maintenance. I'm not even talking about the operational cost of fuel, etc. So we are only talking about just the maintenance and service could be of the order of 2/3. So this is the kind of thing that we need to be aware of in terms of factoring in the cost. So the cost of maintaining or servicing certain traditional materials might be very different from those for the FRPs or advanced materials like the titanium alloys. The titanium, for example, was extensively used for the first time on the SR-71 aircraft. And there you could see that not only in terms of the servicing and maintainability issues, but also during the production itself, the production capabilities in terms of forming this material, machining this material, etc. So many technologies were developed. It's essential to say all these things because very often we kind of bash our Indian entities, except for ISRO. We keep bashing the DRDO, HAL, etc. For the delays that they have in their programs. But if you look at the program developments, especially, for example, the Tejas, LCA, or some of the missiles like Agni, etc., there's a lot of technologies also which are developed along with that. And some of these technologies have taken as much time for development in advanced countries as we have. Just that we had a late start, and therefore it appears that what somebody else has already done, we are doing it so late, and we are consuming so much time, time overruns, etc. But overall, if you see, the classic example is the SR-71. Another example is the Airbus A350 itself, which went into huge time overruns. It's a hugely successful aircraft today. But in terms of the deadlines, it never met them. In terms of the cost also of development, it far exceeded the initial estimates. So why? Because of the new technologies. One is, of course, the composite materials that were involved in a much more extensive way. So here we are only talking about the development in terms of the production manufacture, even more so in terms of the maintainability, the serviceability, repairability. All these issues need to be taken into account when you're talking of materials. So it's essential that since these materials have been around for so long, we do need to understand, even in the case of the fiber reinforced plastics, the various issues associated with them, like for example, I said the typical life is about 30 years, even for commercial aircraft. So many of the FRP components might have already overrun that. So replacement of them, recycling of them. Because with polymers, especially the thermoset polymers that were predominantly used, lately there's been a movement towards thermoplastics, which could be a little better at recycling. So what are the recycling issues there? If there is a crack or something which has developed and a particular portion needs to be repaired, the composite patch repairs that need to be there. Because of the composite patch that you're going to put, say, let's say a particular composite location, there is a damage. So you basically typically cut out over there to have a more uniform shape, an oval or circular, and then you put a patch over there. Now, if that patch is too stiff or too very less stiff, both can create problems because of the stiffness mismatch, and stress concentrations could arise there. So where you're putting the patch is also important. What are the typical stress levels there? And those stress levels are not constant through all phases of flight. Landing and climbing, the maneuvering, the cruise would all have different sources of. So irrespective of how well you design, there will be at least certain phases of flight where the composite patch repair is going to lead to stress concentration. So understanding of all of these aspects, at least from a qualitative point of view, is required for all aerospace engineers, whether we are specializing in materials and structures or not. So this overall understanding is what I'm trying to provide through some of the information that I'm sharing over here. So those of you who are interested in pursuing it further, of course, there are many different sources through which you can pursue that. So the material selection criteria will depend on various things. We have talked already about three very classic ones. That is the specific strength, stiffness, and stability. So in addition, those are primarily looking at the structural performance, but we need to look at the cost as well. And that's where I talked about you have the various kinds of cost. That is the initial material cost as well as the manufacturing cost, which would include all the various ways of manufacturing it, various ways of joining it, because the entire aircraft is never made as a whole. So you have so many parts which need to be joined. So those joining costs and eventually the maintenance service costs that are there. So the key properties that are pertinent to the maintenance cost and the structural performance are these. One, of course, we have already seen the density, weight. For example, even toughness. Toughness is typically defined as the area under the stress strain curve. So if you have the stress, let me just do this. So you have the stress versus strain. Let's say in tension, let's say you have sigma 11 versus gamma 11, the 3D strains that we're talking about. So therefore, it's a property only of the material. Whereas when we're talking about the stress resultants, it becomes a property of both the material as well as the geometry. So here it's a purely material property. And we know for various materials like composites, it could be brittle. It's just a fracture over there. So we are basically talking of the area under this curve, whereas for others which have a nonlinear portion, yield, and then could have a strength hardening in terms of the true stress and in terms of the apparent stress, the stress level comes down. So, but essentially what we are seeing is at some point there is a failure, and whatever is the area under that curve is giving you the energy per unit volume. But again, it's not that which is critical for us. In that case, you have to divide by the density again, just like we did for specific for the value of the strength, value of the stiffness, which is the slope of this curve, and the value of the also in terms of the stability, the E by rho cube that we talked about. So in all those cases, there was a division by density or some power of density that was involved. Similarly, in terms of toughness also, this gives the amount of energy stored per unit volume. But again, what you are interested mostly is energy per unit mass. So you would have to divide that area, whatever area is there over there, by rho in order to get the fracture toughness in a per unit mass kind of thing. Because for a unit mass of weight that you're using, because that's the weight penalty that we're talking about, how much of energy is it able to store? More from the point of view up to fracture. So therefore, in any let's say in components which are designed to absorb those energies, just like in the case of a car, you have the bumper and the front portions which are supposed to deform in order to absorb the energy of the impact. Similarly, you would have various components like the like in the engine, you have a containment structure that is over there, which needs to absorb the energy. So these kinds of things need to be designed from a per unit mass rather than just this area alone. So do keep this in mind that A by rho becomes a critical thing. So density is not only important from those three parameters that we already studied, but this is another example where density could play a role. Then coming to stiffness, again, we talked about the static and dynamic stiffness, one in which there is no square root, the other in which there is a square root that is important, and then the specific strength as well. And there, again, ultimate as well as yield, because once it has yielded, there is a possibility of permanent deformation. It might be okay for that particular flight as if it's a ductile material like what we showed in this particular case, where it has a very large strain at which the hardening starts happening. So there you might be okay for that particular flight, but and you can probably repair it. But overall, you do not want any permanent deformations to set in. So many times the yield will become important in those kinds of materials which do have a yield point. But there are many materials, including metals like aluminum alloys, sometimes do not have a very well-defined yield. And so you define something called a proof stress or something like that, which is about 0.2% or 0.1% a permanent deformation in order to understand in relation to steel alloys that most people are familiar with. And then, of course, stability. And what we already encountered in the earlier class was the elastic stability, which is measured by the material performance parameter E by rho cube. But there's also the aeroelastic stability that we need to take care. Again, in this case also, there's both, just like here, we're talking about static and dynamic stiffness. In the aeroelastic case also, we have the static and dynamic. So examples of which are like, let's say, the airfoil divergence and the flutter. So I'm not sure if we'll have enough time to cover many of these things, but they do need to be taken into account as well. And there again, the material properties apart from the geometry will play a very, very critical role. More so the geometry. So because these are associated with the aerodynamic deformations as well, and therefore the aerodynamic characteristics, how they change. So the change in shape and size can make a huge impact, even more so than in the case of the elastic stability, where also, of course, you do have the length of the column, etc., can be playing a very big role. So then, continuing, there are furthermore few more key properties which are pertinent to the, especially the maintenance cost and the structural performance. More in terms of the life cycle that I talked about, typically 30 years for commercial aircraft, could vary quite a bit for the case of the other kinds of aircraft, let's say fighters or helicopters, etc. So the key properties, and sometimes there's also age extension programs. So you want to see aging aircraft, how you can have a life extension. So in such situations, it becomes even more critical to consider some of these things because the aircraft has been under various stress histories, and those can start contributing. Whereas in a pure elastic model with all those assumptions that we talked about, we are not taking into consideration that all of those things and saying that the stress is dependent only on the stream at a given point of time, at a given location. So that's not the case. The histories could matter. And one such example is the fatigue, where we know that the strength could typically, if you plot, let's say, strength versus the number of cycles of loads that it has gone through, there would be some kind of a decrease in strength, and that could be quite drastic. And depending upon the particular component, what is the level of the stress amplitude variations that you have, and what is the frequency at which it varies, etc. All of that is going to dictate how much the strength is going to drop by. And so that durability is very important in the understanding of fatigue, and that may not be directly evident from those three performance parameters that we have already seen, namely sigma u by rho, E by rho, and E by rho cube. Is not going to tell you the whole story. The fracture toughness, which is the energy stored, that's also not going to tell you the whole story. This is an entirely new thing. And the tests that are involved over here could take a very long period of time, because the number of cycles involved are in tens of thousands of cycles. And for new materials that you're developing, you don't have the data over there. So that gets developed over a period of time. Whereas for traditional materials, you have lots of data related to that which you can utilize. So that is one thing we need to ensure. The other thing is in terms of the damage tolerance. So the damage tolerance, that is, however well you design, you cannot completely avoid damage. So there is going to be some damage somewhere or the other. It's similar to a human body. However well your diet might be, however well your exercise regimen might be, however well your sleeping habits might be, irrespective of that, you might encounter certain issues. So similarly, all materials will encounter certain issues. And once there is a crack, that crack, depending upon its size and location and what kind of loads that component is undergoing, over a period of time, that crack starts growing. So damage tolerance is in terms of how you can see that crack growth rates are as small as possible, and not detrimental to the overall life of that structural component and of the aircraft as a whole. So there, fracture toughness plays a very critical role, which we saw in the previous slide. But in addition, the crack growth rates play a very important role. There's something called the Paris law as the simplest model over there. When you go to composites, etc., you go for more and more generalized versions of that, more complicated versions of that, which are more reliable. So essentially, we need to account for these aspects. The second issue is, one is from the material failure, the other is from the potential of crack growth. The third is from corrosion, because most of these are in environments which are exposed to the atmosphere, which means moisture. If it's, let's say, a naval aircraft operating with the navies, then you have it landing on the ships, carriers, aircraft carriers, and then you have this salt water, the marine kind of corrosion that could exist. Again, you're using multiple materials, remember. So these multiple materials could have different electromotive force potentials. So in other words, some of the materials could be more anodic in nature, some of the materials could be more cathodic in nature. And if these two materials are joined to each other, or the element that you're using to join it, that is the fittings like a rivet or a bolt, happen to be of a material which is very far away in the electromotive force potential, what we talk of as the galvanic list or the electrochemical or electromotive list. They're farther away in terms of the voltages. So then the possibility of galvanic corrosion arises as well. In addition to galvanic corrosion, a single material itself, when it is there, it can have, because of its alloying elements. For example, let's say copper could have electromotive force very different from aluminium, and aluminium copper is the most common material that you use in 24ST or AL 2024 kind of alloys. So is there a possibility of galvanic corrosion arising there? At what length scale it originates, etc. So these are things that you need to be familiar with. In addition, some of these parts, let's say on the wing, where the fuel tank is, and where the fuel is filled from an external fuel tank on the ground or in flight, some of this fuel could spill on the aircraft. So what is the corrosion related to that? There could be battery leakages, because of which typical lead acid kind of battery or any other kind of battery, which is a liquid state rather than solid state like lithium ion. So there you could have these materials causing certain corrosion. You have lubricants which are used during the service procedures. So the maintenance engineers or mechanics or technicians spill some of it. That could cause certain corrosion as well. Even as much as the toilets inside an aircraft, a passenger aircraft. So there is a possibility of any leakage there, that causing certain level of corrosion, some of the structural components as well, depending upon the cracks that are there and which component it reaches, what materials those are made of, etc. So all of that kind of corrosion we need to look at. The third kind of corrosion is in terms of stress corrosion. So corrosion by itself is bad, but in a stressed component, the way it reacts to corrosion is even worse. So it's already under mechanical stress, and then you have a corrosion coming upon it. So especially if the stress is fatigue kind of or cyclic loading, then it is possible that those cracks can start growing. For example, in aluminium alloys, there is a blessing in disguise in the sense that aluminium reacts with oxygen, forms aluminium oxide. In fact, it is originally extracted from aluminium oxide as an ore. But that aluminium oxide can form just a coating or a covering, which prevents the rest of the aluminium from degrading or corroding. But if there is a crack which happens in that, especially in a element which is loaded in fatigue, like for example the vibrations coming from the engine because of the change in the lift distribution, whatever is the compressive tensile load on the skin over there, all these can cause fatigue. And you have it, let's say, made out of aluminium alloy, and then the aluminium oxide or pure aluminium coating is there to protect it. But once the fatigue load is there, those coatings can crack. And once that coating cracks, the oxygen from the ambient air can seep through those cracks and cause further oxidation of the interior. And this can continue further, and that can create major issues for the aircraft. So stress corrosion is a very important thing. So the ability of materials to resist this varies, and you need to see that the kind of materials that you deal with are capable of handling that. Steel is also, again, highly prone to corrosion. That's why you have the stainless steel, for example, but the mechanical properties of those are very, very small. So when you're trying to increase certain things come down. For example, in the aluminium alloy, the initial utilization was mostly in the 2000 series 2024, what we call as 24ST, but later on we moved to the 7000 series where we added zinc in addition to whatever was already there. But that zinc caused certain corrosions, and that corrosion became a major issue over there. In addition, the fatigue properties were much less superior compared to what you already had. So these are things that give or take when you move to a better alloys, so you need to understand. And the aluminium lithium alloys have been around for quite a while now, though compared to the others, they are much more recent. But then their performance under compressive fatigue, where at least one of the ends of the cyclic load is compressive, is relatively poorer. So you would not use them typically in elements which are made out of a lot of these elements. So, for example, the A350 used a lot of these aluminium lithium alloys, but you would not see them used where compression is a major issue. So corrosion has to be taken care of. Next is creep. I think we mentioned this in passing sometime earlier. So the idea is that certain materials, even under static loads, even if that load is not causing a stress beyond the yield point of that material, if that load is existing for a very long period of time, over a period of time, there's a permanent deformation which sets up in spite of not yielding. So that is basically creep. The opposite of that is the stress relaxation that we talked about earlier, which is actually beneficial. But here, that creep can become an issue. So which means that during the manufacturing process and the joining processes, etc., we should ensure that the stresses that are built into the structure are not going to be harmful in terms of developing such creep. So again, creep resistance will vary from material to material. So the choice of material in such components which are more prone to creep, for example, will have to be addressed. For example, if commercial aircraft will keep taking off and landing, within a day they might perform so many sorties. So their time on the ground, yes, it is in the overall life cycle, it's almost 23 years out of the 30 years. But at least they are going through these cycles. But there might be certain aircraft which are bought, like for example, the aircrafts you would see, so many of you tech students have not seen, but if you come to the aerospace department, we have 2 old aircraft which are parked over there, something like that, or even regular aircraft which are smaller size may not be flown as frequently. Even business aircraft may not be flown very frequently. So these are on the ground for a long period of time. So the landing gear, for example, is continuously stressed under compression. And if you use a material which is subject to creep there, then it could have permanent deformation which is happening. And that permanent deformation could sometimes be quite disastrous, especially when the aircraft is landing, or sometimes even during takeoff. So especially if there is an imbalance of one undergoing more than the other, etc. So creep is something that we need to take into account. The last thing is the wear resistance. I think I mentioned this in one of the previous classes as well, when we are talking about the leading edge caps. So you see that in many of these advanced aircraft also, you would have aluminum caps, just like what I was explaining there in a previous class was the helicopter rotor blades, a steel cap for the leading edge. But even if you look at the leading edge of many aircraft like the A350 or the 787, which are made out of entirely composites, mostly the primary load bearing structures, we are going to see even in such situations the leading edge is going to have those kinds of metallic materials, because you do not want the wear resistance, especially when it is cleaned, etc. And also, in terms of the, while we are at the leading edge of the aerodynamic surfaces, the nose of the cone, nose of the fuselage, the nose cone, as we call it, again is typically a very different material from the rest of the aircraft. It's understandable that the cockpit canopy of fighter aircraft as well as transport aircraft is made out of acrylic or some other bulletproof material which is transparent. But even the nose has to be made of a different material. For example, some of the material, some of the aircraft, I forget particular Airbus aircraft and some Boeing aircraft also, you could have most of the aircraft being made out of a CFRP, but the nose cone is made out of a quartz fiber reinforced plastic, because the signals from the ATC and the other aircraft are coming through electromagnetic waves, and you want some material which is kind of transparent to that, so that it seeps into the aircraft and to what the pilot has to get the information fast enough. So you would have certain very different materials. So it may not always be from a structural point of view. There might be non-structural requirements like electromagnetic requirements, which again, in the case of stealth aircraft, etc., it's an entirely different ball game. So so it's quite obvious that from all these requirements that we have seen in this slide as well as in the previous slide, in terms of specific strength, stiffness, stability, etc., a single material cannot deliver all of the desired properties, and therefore you need a combination. One is in the form of alloys, another is in the form of composites, fiber and matrix, and then a hybridization of multiple different composites, composites along with the alloys, many different types of alloys, because each component requirement is different. And then you have the problem with galvanic corrosion because of two different materials coming along. Like even in a bimetallic strip, you can keeping it for in corrosive environments, we can show that there can be galvanic corrosion if there's a huge difference in the EMFs over there. So all of those come into picture. This table we have already seen previously from your textbook. So in terms of E by rho for these materials, there's hardly any difference. In terms of sigma U by rho, there is some small difference, but not something really worth considering. But it's only the E by rho cube which makes a huge difference, and many other parameters that we saw over here make a huge difference as well in terms of, and also the thermal capabilities, etc., whereby these materials could be quite different. For example, titanium could be much better performing compared to titanium, and steel could be much better performing compared to aluminium for higher temperature applications. So these are properties of the aircraft structural materials. Now we go on to each one of them. Some of these we have already looked at, so we are kind of revisiting that. So here you see an example of a flap. The same flap, if it's in the outboard, it would be an aileron, which would be deflected differentially on the two sides, the port and the starboard. But here it's a flap. Many situations you had a flapper on where to maximize your lift, especially under takeoff and landing, where you want to have very large lift coefficients. You might use the aileron also non-differentially, that is in a symmetric deflection, and you have what is known as a flapper-on kind of a configuration. And then you have also, you would have seen many aircraft have, especially the larger aircraft, have these pods. So many new aerospace engineering students are wondering what these pods could be. These pods typically contain the actuator and the actuating path for the control surfaces. So because the flaps are over here, the ailerons over here, so these are massive, and the kind of loads that they encounter when they are deployed, either they are deployed downwards or retracted back to their original position, they could be massive loads. So the transfer of that actuation from the pilot's controls, so in this case it is basically the roll, in the case of the aileron, etc. So you're basically moving the control stick or the wheel to the left or the right. So you're basically seeing that you would be delivering a very large actuation force or moment to these. And so therefore, you need to contain all of that actuating elements and the flow of that control law. So which is why most of these pods are there, even though from an aerodynamic point of view, they are a disaster because they can increase the drag. But that's the reason why you have them covered rather than exposed as just actuators, in which case the drag would be worse. Here you see also the ribs, rib cross sections, which become bigger and bigger as you go towards the end to maintain the shape. And then this is an example where you have a single spar kind of a configuration, but most larger aircraft would have multiple spars. And in this case, you see that this is a T-tail that I talked about in the previous class, even though the engines are not mounted on the aircraft but fuselage, but on the wings, but they're close to the fuselage, and therefore you would want to avoid that. But here you see that there is a small a split that is happening in the horizontal stabilizer. Some cases you would have the canard kind of configuration in the front as well. So all of those are aerodynamic and flight space mechanics realms. I'll not delve too much into that. But these have implications for the structural engineer, even the materials engineer, in terms of the choice of the materials, because where they are dictates what kind of loads they are exposed to, and over what are their time histories, and therefore how do you need to choose the material which is best capable of handling that, and is still reasonably cost effective, and is also available so in large quantities for the number of aircraft that you want to manufacture, and in terms of the serviceability over its lifetime for spare parts, etc. So the aluminium alloys, as you know, have been dominant for many decades, and they offer very good mechanical properties with low density all the way up to 175 degrees centigrade, which is good enough for subsonic and even transonic aircraft. But only when you go for supersonic aircraft, even Mach 2, you see that the temperature has a m squared by 5 over there, or hypersonic planes, hyperplanes, etc., where this obviously is not going to be good enough. So you need to make certain changes, either in the material or bring in certain coatings, etc., to be able to handle those larger temperatures. But for most aircraft, it is good enough, and therefore the 2024, also called as duralumin. The reason why it got this name is in terms of its durability, and also in terms of the hardening process. See, the alloy which was most common, apart from bronze, which is more than 5,000 years old, which is copper and tin, were the steel alloys. And the way the steel was hardened was very different. The steel is mostly carbon to increase the strength of the iron, and then you have other elements added for various purposes. So the way that was hardened was very different in terms of the quenching process, etc., which is very fast cooling after a heat treatment, etc. In the early stages, in the early 19th century, that is about 200 years back, there was an experiment which was done to try the same kind of heat treatment process which was used for steel alloys for aluminium alloys, and actually the strength came down drastically. Very interestingly, I forget the name of the person, scientist involved there. He was a good sailor as well, so for a weekend he just went out sailing after creating these aluminium alloys, 2024 like aluminium alloy. And then when he came back, he saw that its strength had actually increased after the heat treatment, even though it was not quenched the way steel is quenched. In other words, the age hardening process was invoked at that point of time, and that has been a long stay with many of the aluminium alloys over a period of time. So from that aspect, this particular material is also called as duralumin, though it's a specific particular material. The more long-lasting convention that we have introduced is the 1000 series. In this case, the 2000 series, 2024, sometimes also called as 24ST. And since the strength of that was not sufficient in spite of the age hardening process, we introduced the 7075, wherein the additional element was zinc, by reducing the amount of copper that was used to alloy the 2024. So these are the two which are mostly used, 2024 and 7075, especially in aircraft which have been made in the last century and also probably the first decade of this century. Whereas in this decade, from 2010 to 2020, many of the new aircraft have seen many different aluminium alloys being utilized over and above those which were utilized earlier. So again, within the 2024, there could be various heat treatment processes. I'm not very familiar with the codes. T3 and T42 are examples of the heat treatment process. So whatever is the number which follows T refers to that particular heat process. And again, you could have a difference. But the code 2024 itself means that apart from aluminium, which is the primary element of this alloy, the other three secondary elements are copper, manganese, and magnesium. Copper being the lead element, and manganese and magnesium in that order being slightly lesser in percentages. All of them less than 10%, typically around 5%, 2%, etc. So what that copper actually does is, in terms of changing the crystalline structure, the grain structure, etc., to such an extent that you have compared to the original aluminium, pure aluminium, the 1000 series, for example, that is one XYZ, any other numbers XYZ, after one is basically aluminium alloys which are 99% aluminium and only about 1%, which is mostly because of impurities which have not yet been removed. So those have certain applications as well, but from a structural point of view, they're not good enough. So in moving from that to introduction of copper in particular, resulted in excellent fracture toughness, fatigue life, and the slow crack growth rate, all of which we saw in the previous slide as some of the determining factors for this particular material. So then we have this T3 heat treatment, for example, the aluminium alloy 2024, which results from that, is used typically in the fuselage and also the lower wing skins. You know that the major load on the wing is the lift, which is causing bending upwards, and therefore the lower fuselage is going to have tension. So compression is not an issue there. So in such situation, and the tension is varying. So when it comes to the ground, it is bending downwards, but with a very small amount of compression, which is not very critical at all. So essentially, it is having a fatigue which is predominantly tensile. That's what the lower skin and the lower stringers are. So the lower wing skins and to some extent the lower skin stringers also can be made out of this 2024 T3 because of these properties that we talked about, especially very high fatigue life and the excellent fracture toughness that it has, and the slow crack growth as well. So which means that these lower wing skins and the entire fuselage are prone to a lot of fatigue, mostly tensile, and therefore you tend to use this particular material. So one more slide and I will end today's class, because this is also about the aluminium alloys for continuity. And the other most commonly used aluminium alloy in the aerospace industry has been the 7000 series, and in the 7000 series there have been many alloys which have been used, but the one mostly used is the 7075. Again, you have two different heat treatment processes which are common, but all 7075s, the copper is relegated to, is also a secondary alloying element, but it's relegated to lesser importance. It's a zinc, which is in a slightly larger percentage, like copper in the 2000 series. So what zinc does over here is to increase the strength much more. So if you have the stress strain curve, it goes to a much larger value of strength before it undergoes failure. So the ultimate tensile strength is going to be much larger. The proof strength, because it doesn't have any yield strength, the proof strength is also going to be very large compared to the 2000 series. But again, the introduction of zinc more than the copper, it creates certain problems as well. So it has a higher strength than 2024, but it has a lower fracture toughness. So using it in the under part of the wing skin, as well as the stringers on the bottom surface of the wing and fuselage is usually very rare. So you would not want that because of the lower fracture toughness it has because of the introduction of the zinc. And it's on the other hand, for this particular heat treatment, it's used for the upper wing skin, where as we know, it's predominantly under compression. It has very small amount of tension when it comes to the ground because of the self weight of the wing, but that's not a critical load. The critical load is the compression, and there you want very large compressive strengths, and this is what the 7075 provides. So large compressive strength, apart from tensile strength also, but it provides large compressive strength, and which is why you use that. So fatigue is not much of a problem where the dominant load is compression. It's only when the dominant load is tension that it creates those problems. For example, even I talked to you about the coating of aluminum oxide that forms, which gets a crack, and further corrosion can happen. So not only from a corrosion point of view, crack growth, but even the purely mechanical crack growth would be an issue only when it is under tension. The top surface of the wing, both the cover skin as well as the stringers on the top, are going to be predominantly under compression, and therefore you want a more stronger material, which means probably you can use a lesser amount of the material because you can go to a very larger amount of stress, and therefore you bring down the weight. So this is what is happening when you're coming. So you use a thinner skin with 70-75, as opposed to if you are continuing to use 20-24, you would on the top skin, like you are already using on the bottom skin. If you try to use 20-24 on the top skin, you might need a much thicker skin. But now that you've gone for 70-75, which is having a larger strength, the modulus doesn't change much. This you should remember. For all alloys, within the class of a particular primary material, all aluminum alloys typically will have around 70 GPa as the moduli, the elastic moduli or Young's moduli. And then it would have, steel alloys would have around 210, titanium alloys would have around 110, irrespective of what the secondary elements are and how much they are. Yes, there would be a small change, but round about the same. But it's the strength which varies a lot. And usually when we try to increase the strength by a particular alloying element, like zinc in this particular case of the 7000 series, the collateral damage that you get in that material is in terms of lower fracture toughness or lower higher fracture crack growth rate, etc. So, so where fatigue is less of a problem, you can use the 7000 series, and it has been used quite extensively. The other is, of course, relatively more recent, but it's again been around for almost 1 or 2 decades. Probably in some other fighter aircraft, it has been, or military aircraft, it has been around even longer than that. But in larger quantities, it has been predominantly used, especially in the last decade, especially in the Eurofighter Typhoon, and also the Airbus A350. They use the lithium alloy much more because it has even more stiffness. So as I said, stiffness usually doesn't increase with the alloying element. So this is an exception where you see that the stiffness has increased. But there, of course, in the initial stages, people went overboard and used about 2.5% of lithium. Lithium, as you know, in the periodic table is right up front after hydrogen and helium. So it's the lightest metal that you have. Of course, people are trying to look at metallic hydrogen as a possibility, but at room temperature, like mercury, it's also going to be a liquid, so you may not have structural applications, though it could have liquid hydrogen as a metallic hydrogen could have certain other applications in terms of the conductivity, thermal and or electrical, etc., that metals are typically used for. But from a structural point of view, lithium is the lightest element that you could have, and even introducing 2.5% of it can bring down the overall density of the aluminum alloy quite a bit. And so when we're talking about 10% stiffer, the distance between aluminum and lithium on the periodic table is quite a bit. And so in terms of the size of the crystal occupancy that it has, the lithium is much smaller, and therefore it creates a huge difference in the way it behaves, and that's how the stiffness increases. But otherwise, when you're using copper, zinc, magnesium, etc., manganese, you do not find too much of a variation in the stiffness. And then, of course, because lithium is light, it becomes much lighter. So essentially, you have a 21% increase in the stiffness to density ratio, or the specific stiffness values. And in a E by rho cube kind of a configuration for the stability, it could be even more. And the other important thing is, unlike the 7000 series, this is going to have a superior fatigue life, and many cases even higher fatigue life than what was there for the 2000 series also. So, and the aluminum lithium alloys, only one of them or a few of them are in the 8000 series, where many of them have been given the 2000 series. So when I say 2000 series, I'm referring to 2024. So compared to 2024, the aluminum lithium alloys, many of which are also in the 2000 series, have superior fatigue life, and therefore it is replacing many of those places where the 2024 used to be used. The 7000 itself was introduced as a replacement for greater strength, but it has lower fracture and fatigue performance. But the aluminum lithium alloy has a better fatigue life. So those places where you can't use 7000 because of its poor fracture and fatigue, you would instead use the aluminum lithium alloy, and that's where you would see. So you can actually see Flight International magazine, which is having a website called Flight Global. You would see many cutouts, and for more recent aircraft, you would see like the 350. You would see there's a large percentage of the aluminum lithium alloy which is used, even in those portions where typically 2024 or 24ST was used, because they're under tension mostly and fatigue kind of loading, because the aluminum lithium alloy is actually good in fatigue as well. So with this, we will conclude the discussion of aluminum alloys on Tuesday's class next week. We will take up the steel alloys and the titanium alloys before looking at composites, and then hopefully we would complete that in the next class, and then move on to the introduction to the theory of elasticity. Only those parts of theory of elasticity which you don't need to unlearn in order to relearn some of the state-of-the-art techniques. So I will also give you I think probably on Thursday's class, I'll give you an introduction to the state-of-the-art without going into too much of details of the equations. And I will also in a later class talk about the final set of equations without a derivation for those. Those derivations will be done in the nonlinear mechanics of composite structures course that I'll be teaching next semester. But I will give you the outline. So those of you who are not going to continue with structures or materials, at least will have an understanding of actually how simple those equations are, and why the hell were we dealing with the textbook formula of strength of materials, knowing fully well that the assumptions are not valid, and therefore the accuracy, fidelity, or reliability of those models was so poor. So, which is, as I said, the reason why I'm not introducing those, but giving you a flavor for what is essential in an overall understanding, even for non-structural engineers. So thank you very much. So the class ends here, but those of you who have any questions or doubts can stay back and ask me.
Sir, that hello, sir. This is someone. Sir, the formula which you gave, T equal to T ambient 1 plus m square by 5.
Yeah.
So for the commercial aircraft, the Mach number is around 0.8, 0.9. So the temperature of the skin, I think it will be equivalent to the ambient temperature, no?
Yeah.
Only.
Yeah. So for subsonic aircraft, even transonic aircraft, that's not something to be considered. So, which is why aluminum alloys up to 175 degrees centigrade are good enough. See also that you are climbing to a high altitude and flying where the temperatures are very low. In fact,
yes, sir.
Yeah. So you would have almost, in certain cases, very high altitude flights, even cryogenic requirements might become essential over there, unless they are flying very fast, and that is compensating the lower temperatures at of the atmosphere over there. So it's a combination of all these things that you need to take into account, and also for structural components or materials which are close to where the engines are, or engine components themselves. Here we are not talking about the materials which are going into the engines like Inconel, etc., which are typically nickel-based alloys or metal matrix and ceramic matrix composites. So leaving those aside, what are called as super alloys, even for the other materials, it's only in very high supersonic aircraft. For example, even supersonic of the order of, let's say, Mach 2, which almost all fighter aircraft will be capable of. You're talking of 2 squared by 5, which is 4 by 5, which is fairly large, about 80% increase in the temperature over the ambient temperature. And so that can, of course, the ambient temperature in that formula and also the skin temperature are all in Kelvin. So they're not in degrees centigrade, they're in Kelvin. Otherwise, you can't have that kind of a fraction over there. You have to make corrections for that plus.
Okay. That is Kelvin. Okay.
Right. Yes, so both those temperatures are in Kelvin. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Welcome, Samanvay. Anybody else? Any questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Then we will continue the class next time. Goodbye.
Bye, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Most welcome.
मृत्युञ्जय मन्त्राः
त्र्यम्बकं यजामहे सुगन्धिं पुष्टिवर्धनम् उर्वारुकमिव बन्धनान् मृत्योर्मुक्षीयमामृतात् ये ते सहस्रमयुतं पाशा मृत्योर्मर्त्याय हन्तवे तान् यज्ञस्य मायया सर्वान् वयजामहे मृत्यवे स्वाहा मृत्यवे स्वाहा